big issue these days, and nothing to do with his talk, is this idea of self-reflection and of things that self-referential things that and the paradoxes that can come out of that. And I find Terence McKenna a kind of self-referential person. He's spoken to us at least once, twice I think, right? And each time I have experienced an almost hallucinogenic experience in listening to him talk. And I'm looking forward very much tonight to hearing him speak on dreams, hallucinogens, and UFOs. New and old maps of hyperspace. Take off.
Well, thank you very much. I'm very glad to be here. Special thanks to Ruth and Arthur and the Institute for asking me back for a third time. Perhaps the third time is the charm. We'll see here. My name is Terence McKenna, and my training is basically in shamanism and botany and ethnography. And my interest is in hallucinogenic drugs, especially plant hallucinogens as they're used in a shamanic context. And what impels me to speak to a room full of people like this is the belief that the major important point regarding hallucinogens has been largely overlooked, even though we're now 15 or 20 or 30, depending on how you count it, years into the psychedelic age. The central point about the psychedelic experience is the content of the experience. And this has been occluded or obfuscated by the behavioral and statistical and scientific methods that have been brought to bear to study hallucinogenic experience. So what I'm going to address this evening is essentially my own experience with hallucinogens and how I extrapolate it into the world based on its own being and other people's psychedelic experiences that I have interacted with. Before I get into that, I want to clarify something about shamanism. There are two schools about the basis of shamanism, shamanistic experience. One is the older school exemplified by Mircea Eliade, who holds that all narcotic shamanism is decadent. He prefers drumming, dancing, self-mutilation, even ordeal poisons, all precede the efficacy of hallucinogens. He believes they are resorted to when the tradition is vitiated and people are grasping at straws. I take this to be simply a cultural bias of the school of anthropology that he exemplified and the time in which his work was done. Now, Gordon Wasson has taken the opposite tack and takes the position that non-narcotic shamanism is decadent because it is on its way to becoming ritual. In other words, drumming, fasting, flagellation, all these things work to a degree and sometimes, and they are not dependable in the same way that hallucinogens are. And this has created this plays on Western people's biases in favor of the idea that you have to work hard to get somewhere, and if you don't work hard, it isn't useful. My own experience in looking at non-narcotic shamanism, essentially non-narcotic shamanism in Indonesia and in Nepal, was that Wasson's intuition was very correct. There is a grasping after, and I see that grasping after blending into the evolution of all higher religions. In other words, experientially, there is only one religion, and it is shamanism and shamanic ecstasy. But it is very difficult to maintain in agrarian context, hunting and gathering societies, which have much less structured social hierarchies, seem to be able to function with the hallucinogenic experience embedded in them. As soon as you rise even to the level of primitive agriculturalists, it becomes much more important to be able to get up in the morning and go to work than it does to have these ecstatic experiences, because the plants have to be tended, the fields tilled, and so on. I formed these opinions about non-narcotic shamanism early in my career of looking at this phenomenon. I didn't contact narcotic shamanism until I went to the Amazon basin, initially in 1971. And although I was familiar with the hallucinogenic state from growing up basically in the counterculture in Berkeley, but what I found in South America after sifting through these various experiences is that the family of drugs constellated around tryptophan, specifically DMT, dimethyltryptamine, and psilocybin, which is chemically very similar to DMT, that these compounds had a relationship to reality far different from all the other hallucinogens. The scopolamine, hyoscyamine, tropane family that you get in datura and that kind of thing, or LSD, which laboratory LSD does not occur in nature, but isomers of it occur in nature, although to be taken at hallucinogenic doses, they must be taken at hundreds of times the amount. So that's basically the scientific, medical, anthropological basis of what I'm saying. A career spent in Asia and more recently in the Amazon looking at this phenomenon. And I want to take my conclusions tonight and contrast them with the modern predicament and try to make a model using the hallucinogenic experience, a model that makes some of the anxieties of being human, and especially some of the anxieties of being human in the 20th century context, more palatable. And to do that, I want to evoke a number of abysses, a number of empty places that our minds tend normally to shy away from. First to invoke them, and then to integrate them through the idea of what is conventionally called the UFO, or the UFO experience. These abysses are basically four embedded in a fifth. The four are the biological abyss that is represented by death and dying, that is the central crisis of every individual existence, and almost as a reflection of that crisis on a higher plane, the historical abyss represented by the end of history and the apocalypse and possibly the millennium, but in any case, the end of history that Western religion, whether it be Judaism, Christianity, or whatever, has appointed to our world and made basic to Western man's view of things, and which now, because of the existence of nuclear weapons and this kind of thing, poses a terminal threat to the culture. So, two abysses, the biological and the historical, the latter being symbolized in the apocalyptic crisis. A third abyss could be called the psychological, and this is represented by dreams, most in general experience, and by hallucinogens. It is this casting off from the moorings of the ego, making the night sea journey into the other, and being at the mercy of, call it the collective unconscious, the overmind of the species, what have you. The fourth abyss, which is one whose emergence is unique in our time, is the actual physical abyss which surrounds this planet for light years in all directions, because suddenly now, because of our level of technology and scientific mapping, we realize that it is there, and we realize that it is a source of our cosmic loneliness, and we realize that it presents an immense challenge of the sort we like to accept as a Western culture, challenges of energy, engineering, and distance. So these are the four abysses: the abyss of space, the abyss of death, the abyss of the psychedelic experience, and the abyss of dying. And these four general categories have to be seen embedded in a somewhat subtler kind of abyss, which is the abyss of the unspeakable. In other words, that language, which is the primary tool of cognition of the species, casts nets against these other gulfs and comes away with different kinds of maps. But you cannot put much trust in these maps unless you've carried out a thorough analysis of language, and once you've done that, for sure you will not put much trust in any of these maps, because the thinness of the web on which it all is hung will be readily apparent. Okay. It's my assumption whenever I am confronted with opposites is to try to unify them, to create a coincidentia positorum, as was done in alchemy, to not force the system to closure, but to try and leave the system open enough so that the differences can resonate and become complementary rather than antithetical. So I would like to unify here not two dualisms, but these four oppose, these pairs. You could think of them as the quadripartite elements of a kind of mandala. The means to unifying that mandala is integration of the psychedelic experience. Specifically, I'm going to make the assumption, specifically the psilocybin or tryptamine experience. And what it appears to be is something which is much more assimilable to the science fiction metaphor of a parallel universe than it is to the Freudian metaphor of the repression of desire, or even the Jungian metaphor of a collective species-wide memory and experience bank. It is much more, I think, of the character of a parallel continuum. And in order to erect the intellectual edifice of the past 1,000 years, this possibility has had to be ignored, much in the way that you would apply Occam's razor to a situation and just say, well, we will not admit the more complex phenomenon because we should form a theory that is true to the simplest phenomena first and then build out from it. And this has worked in a demonic kind of way, in the sense that we have taken command of the atomic world, which is a very simple world compared, for instance, to the variables that you meet in sociology or biology, but at the cost of formulating theories about how the world is put together that nowhere come tangential to experience. So we have a bizarre situation where our best models of reality that are kept for us by the priesthood of science are like exhibits in a museum because they cannot be mapped on to the simple fact of individual experience. Shamanism, on the other hand, is this worldwide, since Paleolithic times, tradition which says that you must make your own experience the centerpiece of any model of the world that you build. No amount of readings from meters, whether they're metering cyclotrons or any other kind of instrument, are going to satisfy you. Once you understand that, then what the task becomes is one of making sense of these metaphors, so-called, or myths, so-called, that are the pre-Western, pre-print, pre-literate mappings of the world. An example of how this problem distorts other problems is the problem of extraterrestrial contact, which is the way science presents the problem of extraterrestrial contact is that we are alone, and that to assuage our cosmic loneliness, we should build ever larger radio telescopes and million-channel signal analyzers and sift the radio noise coming from the stars. And eventually, if a signal is found, an immense philosophical turning point will have occurred, and we will then place ourselves in the context of the cosmos. This is actually a red herring kind of argument, because outside of the highly technical Western societies that have evolved in the last 300 years, people have been talking to the other since man began. Angels, demons, fairies, sprites, elves, all of this is as phenomenologically a part of human experience as, we'll say, birds of paradise, which I'm sure none of you have ever had anything to do with, but believe inflexibly that such creatures exist because it is allowed by the experts that they exist. What psilocybin focuses as a problem that these other hallucinogens do not is it allows a dialogue with the other that is full of give and take. In other words, there are entities in the hallucinogenic world that psilocybin and DMT and a few other not well known or widely distributed plant hallucinogens induce. I think it was William Blake who said, the truth cannot be told so as to be understood without being believed. And this is the kind of information that is coming through the psilocybin experience. It is information which you have to believe it. You have to believe it because it has this ring of authenticity. It is the logos. It is the word somehow. And what is being said is that our alienation, and this word is interesting, alienation, our alienation from ourselves has caused us to set up a number of straw men that are keeping us from building actually a mature model of how the universe really works. The content of the dialogue with the other is a content that indicates that man's horizons are infinitely bright, that death is in fact, as Thomas Vaughan put it, the body is the placenta of the soul. And this fact has not yet been assimilated because it runs counter to Western reductionist, materialist empiricism. But this idea that the body is placenta to the soul is not an object of faith or a dogma. It's a program for activity. The activity that it implies should be undertaken is a familiarization with the soul. And the soul has been banned from Western thinking about the self for nigh on 400 years, at least in leading circles. But I take this concept very seriously. And I think, if any of you are familiar with the literature of alchemy, alchemy is about the generation of a psychic construct, a wholeness, a thing which has many properties, which is paradoxical, which is both mind and matter, which can do anything. This is the last gasp of the soul before it's submerged completely. In other words, it became trapped in an association with chthonic matter in the last historical epoch before it disappeared completely from Western consciousness. Psychedelic drugs, especially psilocybin, allow a searchlight to be thrown on these deeper levels of the psyche, as Jung correctly stated, but it is not a museum of archetypes or psychic constructs, as he seemed to assume. It is a frontier of wholeness into which any person so motivated and so courageous as to wish to do it can go and leave the mundane plane far behind. In other words, it is a dimension of vertical gain that is real and is present in all of our lives, and that we do not acknowledge except as an anomaly because we have been told that it's an anomaly. We have been told that these perceptions have to be devalued. The result of this is to so distort the psychic life of the species in the present historical context that we have this UFO disease, which is essentially a rupture into three-dimensional space of this archetype of wholeness. And it haunts time like a ghost. And it haunts human experience in the 20th century because it is a symbol of alienation. And the word alien has, in fact, come to be applied to this thing. It is alien. It comes from the stars. It is totally non-human. It has great potential for mankind, but it can barely be Englished at all. And actually, what it is the self in the form in which it is most accessible to the ego, given the ego's programming with all this scientific garbage about the density of life in the universe, the distance to the stars, the probability of chemical evolution occurring here and there and yonder. It is, in other words, something which, in order not to alarm us, has disguised itself as an extraterrestrial being, but is in fact the collectivity of the human psyche, signaling a profound historical crisis. I talked about this before. I talked about the danger of succumbing to belief in UFOs because of the damage it did to free will. And that, yes, the UFO is making war on science, because science has created such a masculine overbalance in the intellectual life of the species that this automatic mechanism has been triggered. A history-stopping archetype is being released into the skies of this planet. And if we are not careful, it will halt all intellectual inquiry in the same way that the Christos archetype halted intellectual inquiry in the Hellenistic age. I don't want to go into this too deeply, but it's clear to me that Hellenistic science was destroyed by the Christos archetype because the Democritean atomists and materialists who ran Roman civilization had no patience whatsoever with this superstition that was being circulated among the servants about a man who rose from the dead and all of that went with it. But before they knew what had happened, their whole civilization was in ruin because the archetype had frozen the forward thrust of this masculine, dominant, ethically depotentiated, technologically obsessed, slave-built society. And for 1,000 years, hydrostatics, mathematics, metallurgy, you name it, that was nothing. Only the words of one Galilean radical could occupy the time of any intellectual successfully. Okay, we have now, 2,000 years later, fought our way somewhat clear of that problem. But the problem it solved, which is the problem of this masculine overbalance and this obsessive technological thrust, this dehumanizing thrust, has reached an even more intense peak. And Now appears the flying saucer with the capacity of undoing that by again destroying science, by simply being a miracle. That's all that is required to wreck science, is a miracle visible worldwide. And this, because scientists say that that can't happen. Consequently, if it does happen, their house is in real disorder. So I touched on this before, any of you who heard me. Tonight I want to talk more about the flying saucer, not from the point of view of the people who are going to get the whammy when it appears unbidden, but from the point of view of an insider. In other words, one can do more than simply say, oh yes, I understand what this is. The overmind is visibly manifest in the skies of Earth in order to skew history toward an eschatological mode that will stifle inquiry in order, basically, to preserve the species from extinction. But a mature humanity could get into a place where we no longer required these metaphysical spankings from messiahs and flying saucers that come along every 1,000 years or so to mess up the mess that has been created and to try and send people off on another tack. And the way to do this is to look at the abysses that confront man as species and individual and try to unify them. And I think that psilocybin offers a way out because it allows a dialogue with the overmind that is not, you won't read about it in Scientific American or anywhere else. You will carry it out. And the carrying out of this dialogue will essentially eschatologize you as a person and lift you out of the historical context. It's like Stephen Dedalus said in Ulysses, history is the nightmare that I am trying to awake from. Well, I would turn it around a bit and say history is what I am trying to go to sleep from in order to get away from it. In other words, the dream is eschatological. The dream is zero time and outside of history. Escape into the dream. Escape, a key thing charged against these drugs, that they are for escapists. I think the people who make this charge hardly dare dream to what degree they are escapist. Escape. Escape from the planet, from death, and from the problem, if possible, of the unspeakable. So now, to say a bit about death and dying. If you leave aside the last 300 years of historical experience as it was handled in Europe and America, and examine the phenomenon of death, the doctrine of the soul in all its ramifications, Neoplatonic, Christian, dynastic, Egyptian, etc. I'm sure you're all familiar with some or all of these. What you get is the idea that there is a light body or a thing, an intellecty, that is somehow mixed up in the body during life and at death or at dying is involved in a crisis in which these two envelopes separate and one loses its raison d'etre and falls into dissolution, metabolism stops, and the other one goes we know not where. Perhaps nowhere, if you believe it doesn't exist. But then you have the problem of trying to explain life, which, by the way, though science makes great claims and has done very well in systems of nuclear particles and even simple atomic systems, the idea that science can make any statement about what life is or where it comes from is preposterous. Science has nothing to say about how you can decide to close your hand into a fist, and it happens. This is utterly outside the realm of scientific explanation, because what we see in that phenomenon is mind as a first cause. In other words, we see matter. It's an example of telekinesis. Matter is caused by mind to move. So we need not fear the sneers of science in the matter of the fate or origin of the soul. And as I say, my thrust into this has always been the psychedelic experience, but I've been thinking recently more about dreams, because dreams are a much more generalized form of experience of the hyperdimension, or the mode in which life and mind seem to be embedded. And looking at dreams and looking at what people with shamanic traditions say about dreams, you come to the realization that experientially for those people it is a parallel continuum. The shaman accesses it with hallucinogens or other things which I mentioned, but most efficaciously with hallucinogens. But everybody else accesses it through dreams. Now, Freud's idea about dreams was, I forget the German term, but he called them day residues. He always felt that you could trace the content of the dream down to a distortion of something that happened during the day, or, during waking time. I think that it's much more useful to try and make actually a kind of geometric model of consciousness, and to take seriously the idea of a parallel continuum, and to say that the mind and the body are embedded in the dream, and the dream is a kind, not a kind of, but a higher order spatial dimension, so that in sleep you are released into the real world, of which the world of waking is only the surface. And in a very literal sense, it's the surface. It's the surface in a geometric sense, that there is a plenum, and recent experiments in quantum physics tend to back this up. There is a holographic plenum of information. All information is everywhere. Information that is not here is nowhere. And that information stands outside of historical time. It's like Plato said, time is the moving image of eternity. Eternity, it does not have a temporal existence, even the kind of temporal existence where you say it always existed. It does not have temporal duration of any sort. It is eternity. We are not primarily biology, with mind emerging as a kind of iridescence, a kind of epiphenomenon at the higher levels of organization of biology. We are, in fact, hyperdimensional objects of some sort which cast a shadow into matter. And the shadow in matter is the body. And at death, what happens, basically, is that the shadow withdraws, or the thing which casts the shadow withdraws, and metabolism ceases, and matter, which had been organized into a dissipative structure in a very localized area, sustaining itself against entropy by cycling material in and degrading it and expelling it, that whole phenomenon ceases. But the thing which ordered it is not affected by that. And when I make these declarative statements, I'm making them from the point of view of this shamanic tradition, which touches all these higher religions. Everything, basically, except rationalism, holds to some version of what I'm saying. So then the psychedelic, the dream state and the psychedelic state acquire great import, because there is then a task to life. And the task to life is to become familiar with this thing which is causing being, and to be familiar with it at the moment of passing. In other words, the metaphor is used by several traditions of a vehicle, an after-death vehicle, an astral body, something like that. And shamanism and certain yogas, Taoist yoga, claim very clearly that the purpose is to familiarize yourself with this after-death body in life. And then the act of dying will not create confusion in the psyche. You will recognize what is happening, you will know what to do, and you will make the clean break. And there does seem to be the possibility of a problem in dying. In other words, what I'm telling you is not that you're condemned to eternal life. I'm saying it's a possibility, but you can muff it through ignorance. In other words, at the moment of death, there is a kind of a separation. It's like birth. The metaphor is trivial but perfect. It is there is a possibility of damage, of incorrect activity. Again, William Blake, who said that as you start into the spiral, there is the possibility of falling from the golden track into eternal death. But it is only a crisis of a moment. It's a crisis of passage. And the whole purpose of shamanism and of life, correctly lived, is to strengthen the soul and to strengthen the relationship to the soul so that this passage can be cleanly made. Okay, this is not anything earth-shaking, or it's well known. It's a traditional position, actually. But now I want to assimilate one more abyss into this model, one less familiar to us as rationalists, but well familiar to us just one level deeper in the psyche as Christians and Westerners, and that is this idea that the world will end, that there will be a final time, that there is not only the crisis of the death of the individual, there is the crisis of the death of the species. What this seems to be about is that from the time that there is an awareness of the existence of the soul, we'll say circa 50,000 BP, until the resolution of the apocalyptic potential, there's something like 50,000 years, which in biological time is only a moment, but it is the entire span of history times 5. In that period, everything hangs in the balance because it is a mad rush from monkeydom to starshiphood. And in the leap across those 25,000 years, energies are released, religions are shot off like sparks, philosophies evolve and die, science arises, magic arises, all of these things which control power with greater and lesser degrees of ethical constancy appear. There is the possibility, as in the metaphor of dying, there is the possibility of mucking it up, of aborting the species transformation into a hyperspatial intellecty. We are now, there can be no doubt that we are now in the final seconds of that crisis, a crisis which involves the end of history, the departure from the planet, the triumph over death, and the release of the individual from matter. We are, in fact, closing distance with the most profound event a planetary ecology can encounter, which is the freeing of life from the dark chrysalis of matter. The old metaphor of psyche as the butterfly is a species-wide metaphor. We must undergo a metamorphosis in order to survive the momentum of the historical forces already in motion. Well, if you know anything about evolutionary biology, you know that man is considered to be an unevolving species. In other words, sometime in the last 100,000 years, with the invention of culture, the biological evolution of man ceased, and evolution became a cultural phenomenon. Tools, languages, and philosophies began to evolve, but the human somotype began to remain the same. And so we are very much like people a long time ago. But technology is the real skin of our species. Man, correctly seen in the context of the last 500 years, is an extruder of a technological shell. We take in matter that has a low degree of organization. We put it through mental filters, and we extrude Lindisfarne Gospels, space shuttles, all of these things. This is what we do. We're like coral animals embedded in a technological reef of extruded psychic objects. And the tool is the flying saucer or the soul exteriorized in three-dimensional space. It's, as James Joyce said, it's the problem of how man may be dirigible, right? And how man may be dirigible is basically by turning himself inside out. In other words, the body must become an interiorized hologrammatic object embedded in a solid-state hyperdimensional matrix, which is eternal, so that man wanders through Elysium in his body. This is a kind of Islamic paradise that I'm putting out here. Wanders through Elysium in his body, experiencing all the pleasures of the flesh, but not realizing that he is a holographic projection of a solid-state matrix that is micro-miniaturized, superconducting, and nowhere to be found. It is part of the plenum. And all history is about producing prototypes of this situation with greater and greater closure toward the ideal, so that airplanes, automobiles, condominiums, space shuttles, space colonies, starships of the hardware, speed of light, spin-dizzy drive type, all of these are, as Mircea Eliade says, self-transforming images of flight that speak volumes about man's aspiration to self-transcendence. So that our wish, our salvation, and our only hope, basically, is to end the historical crisis by becoming the alien, by ending alienation, by recognizing the alien as the self, in fact, recognizing the alien as an overmind which holds all the physical laws of the planet intact in the same way that you hold an idea intact in your mind. In other words, all these givens, which are thought to be so writ in adamantine, are actually merely the moods of the God, if you will, which we happen to be. And the whole thing about human history is recovering this piece of lost information so that man may be dirigible. Or, again, to quote Finnegan's Wake, Moycane is the red light district of Dublin. Here in Moycane we flop on the seamy side, but up in the Ent, prospector, you sprout all your worth and you woof your wings. So if you want to be phoenixed, come and be parked. It's that simple, you see. But it takes courage to be parked when the grim reaper draws near. A blessing in disguise, Joyce calls him. So, to me, what psychedelics point out, and where I think society will go once they are integrated to the point where large groups of people can plan research programs without fear of being persecuted for it, is it models the after-death state. It may do more than model it. It may essentially reveal the nature of it.